Hi, this is CP back after a long hiatus, and welcome to Help I'm Teaching. Today's episode is the first one that isn't related to biology or chemistry. It's a lot more of a social science topic. Now, I don't think anyone's genuinely going to ask you to teach kids an entire subtopic of psychology, but once kids have an awareness of this force, it can get them thinking about how they interact with the world and shape them into more conscious individuals. Today's episode is about social identity theory. The basic idea of social identity theory is pretty simple. It's the idea that when you create a group, even if it's totally arbitrary, it can lead to cooperation between members, but also hostility between them and other groups. First, before even introducing the lesson, ask the kids to say the first things that come to mind when they ask themselves, I am. You might get responses like, I am Asian, I am a basketball fan, I am a Boy Scout, etc. Collect all of these, then go through them one by one and ask if each response is identifying with a specific group or not. You'll probably find that, rather than purely physical or mental traits like height or temperament, most of them identify with groups, and that people tend to base their identities on the groups they belong to. You can ask them if they're proud to be in these groups, and if they mention these groups to you, they probably are. You can also more visibly demonstrate social identity theory by splitting kids up into two groups via random chance like coin flips. Next, assign the teams some cooperative task like putting a jigsaw puzzle together. When both teams have finished, ask the kids for words to describe their team and words to describe the other team. Maybe have them write their answers, but watch this one carefully, it can get ugly. Both of these activities lead into the idea that kids, and all humans, like to form groups. And in this context, forming a group doesn't just mean you get along better with others in your group, it also means you tend to dislike members of other groups. If you have books on hand, you can probably find the Dr. Seuss classic, Sneetches on Beaches. In the book, the Sneetches are bird people living on a beach. Some have green stars on them, and some don't. This has zero effect on anything physical, but the green-starred Sneetches use it as an excuse to shun the plain ones and ban them from outings. One day, a salesman comes along and offers the plain ones the opportunity to get stars of their own so they'll be accepted. Predictably, a lot of them do it. However, the original green-starred Sneetches, feeling threatened by their lack of uniqueness, have their stars removed by the same salesman instead. Eventually, the Sneetches are getting stars added and removed so fast that no one remembers who was what originally, and the only winner is the salesman, who laughs all the way to the bank. You can lead into the study of Cialdini, 1976, where, after a football game between two colleges, students were interviewed about how they believed their school's team performed. It was found that students of the winning school were more likely to refer to their school's team using personal pronouns like we and us. Furthermore, they were also more likely to wear school merchandise. You could talk about the Asch conformity experiments. In these, a researcher would ask a group of people to choose the longest line out of a sequence. However, all but one of the group was in on the joke, so to speak, and chose a line that was clearly not the longest. The results came from the one person who wasn't in on it, and it turned out most of the time they chose the clearly wrong one the rest of the group chose. I know what you're thinking, but you shouldn't replicate this one. It'll impart the lesson for sure, but it's a bit cruel. Ask them about times in their lives when they went along with a group and got emotional. An easy example, like I mentioned before, is sports teams, where people might fall into a depressive stupor or celebrate wildly depending on the actions of people they probably have zero personal connection to. Here are some common misconceptions. It was originally thought by Muzazer Sharif in 1966 that conflict among groups would only emerge if there was competition among limited resources. But in 1979, Henri Tajfel, creator of social identity theory, later provided contrary evidence. It seems group hostility can just form by having groups. He later discovered that conflict could even emerge if the groups knew that they were formed on arbitrary criteria like flipping a coin. Sometimes, people can't be separated from their group identities, especially if other people don't let them. Ethnicity is an example of this. If the world was totally indiscriminate, it would be a different story, but unfortunately, it's not. Telling someone to let go of their racial identity and stop letting it define them, while there exist many very real people-caused problems for others of that identity, is more than a little insensitive. Despite everything I've just mentioned, it's important to remember that forming groups isn't an inherently evil thing that always leads to conflict. Sometimes forming a group identity can be a way to get through tough situations, which is why the term solidarity is used when a tragedy happens. Notice how often people say, stand together? Plus, that enhanced cooperation can come in handy. This is presumably why companies say, we're like a family when they expect you to work harder for less pay. Okay, that one's pretty evil. Now some questions. How can we as educators use these norms to our advantage? In a class of 20 where 2 people are acting up, that's only 10% of the class, and if everyone else stays silent, they're likely to calm down when they realize they look silly. However, in a class of 8, 2 people is fully a fourth of the total, and suddenly it seems much more acceptable to join them. Similarly, bigger groups can provide anonymity from one's acts if everyone is acting the same, but it can also provide strong social norms to act appropriately. This is why I've heard that instead of excessively scolding misbehaving students, you should congratulate and emphasize the good ones to reinforce your expected classroom norms. One thing I've seen my more experienced coworkers do is assign students with helper roles like passing out papers and taking attendance. Not only does this reduce work on your end, it makes them feel more like they belong to the classroom as an identity, and you'll be less likely to disrupt the group if you feel connected to it. How do we account for nonconformist and counterculture types? From guerrilla art movements to the one student who gets a kick out of disrupting the lesson, people who define themselves as being against the majority exist everywhere. Morrison and Wheeler 2010 found out that people who were led to believe that their opinions were in the minority had a greater sense of self-clarity than those who believed they were in the majority. The first thing of note is that the culture one grows up in plays a large role. In some individualist cultures, this is seen as a positive self-expression and part of one's personal journey. In other collectivist cultures, it's seen as foolhardy and dangerous. So how do we quantify this? In the famous study of Morrison-Peng, 1994, groups of American and Chinese students were shown a picture of fish swimming in a school with one fish swimming in the opposite direction, and they were asked why they thought it chose to do that. American students tended to have answers like, it wanted to form its own group or it disagreed with them, while the Chinese students thought it was being excluded from the group by the other members. The study of Clegg 2017 showed that American adults tended to rank non-conforming children as more intelligent than others. Adults from Ni Vanuatu, an ethnic group in Melanesia, thought the opposite, ranking non-conforming children as less intelligent. This isn't to say that everyone living in a collectivist culture is a collectivist themselves or vice versa, but it's good to recognize that some cultures have different priorities. Psychologists theorize that this may be because certain subsistence activities, like intensive agriculture, value cooperation more than others like hunting small game and gathering. Sometimes people can form groups around not conforming, especially if the norm is ever present and oppressive. In fact, this is often involuntary but unintentional. Muller 2021 defines a concept called linked fate, wherein 2 outgroup members who are discriminated against by the same in-group can cooperate better with each other. She specifically refers to members of the queer community who have varying sexual orientations and gender identities, but share the caveat of not following the traditional model. How do we stop social identity from interfering with our groups while still maintaining cooperation? This is probably the most important question to ask. Social identity theory interfering in groups is a well-documented phenomenon known as groupthink, where people don't want to go against the consensus because they think it will make them look bad. The Challenger disaster in particular provided lots of evidence for the consequences of groupthink, with many engineers confessing that they knew something was wrong, but due to internal pressure, couldn't speak up. One strategy employed to fight this is the devil's advocate. Named for a former official position in the Catholic Church, this strategy has a person who is designated to take the opposite position from the group and argue for it. Importantly, whether they believe it or not, it is their job to formulate and present these arguments. This is also a good way to teach kids debate skills by having them take positions they don't agree on regarding things like more homework or wearing school uniforms. You could also try to anonymize certain kinds of decision-making to reduce pressure. This can not only encourage students to voice dissent against popular opinions, it also stops students' opinions on the presenter from coloring their appraisal of the idea. How do we stop conflicts between groups as well without affecting cooperation? Abing 2019 maintains that in-group favoritism could be driven by different forces from out-group discrimination. The study conducted showed that when 2 rival political groups, A and B, were asked to give amounts of money to selected people in the groups, and then do the same for a politically neutral group who supported neither party, or C, people within A would give more money to other A members, and same for B. A members also gave less to B, and vice versa. However, A and B were a bit more generous when giving to group C than when they were giving to their opposite group. This implies that it's not the presence of groups itself that is the main driver of conflict, but the fact that A and B were ideologically opposed. What I'm taking from this is that organizations have different departments, but still all work together under one umbrella, unless you have a really badly managed organization. HR isn't competing to do better than R&D, for example. I think that based on this, one way around outgroup conflict could be by giving different groups their own metrics, so direct comparison and competition is harder. HR can't compete with R&D because how do you compare them? Dollars spent versus workplace culture improved? To close, forming groups is still a great way to motivate us and get us to accomplish great things. We just need to be aware of how it can affect the way we see others. If the Sneak just celebrated their differences, things wouldn't have gotten so bad on that beach. And all this stuff right here is why celebrate your differences is such a popular slogan. By amplifying and celebrating what sets us apart, we can prevent people from hating each other based on those things. For the kids who seem especially interested in psychology, I'd recommend delving deeper into Muzaffar Sharif's Robber's Cave experiment. I cited it briefly above, but it was basically a psychologist's attempt to drive a wedge between two groups of boys living on a campground over basically nothing at all. Conflict arises, insults are hurled, and social psychology is better off for it. I'll link a good, easy-to-follow source in the transcript. For a more mature, maybe late middle to high school student, you could talk about the famous Stanford prison experiment. If you haven't heard of it, a guy named Philip Zimbardo randomly divided college students into two groups labeled guards and prisoners and left them in a simulated prison environment. The guards weren't given too many instructions other than maintain order, and these people were specifically screened to not be inherently aggressive, but the mere act of separating them into two groups, along with an implied hierarchy, created conditions so bad that the experiment had to end early. When discussing these, always try to link it back to things going on in the real world. How do these findings apply to, say, video game console discourse or modern law enforcement? I'm sure they have their own examples and hypotheses to discuss. And if they're reading the assigned reading classic, Lord of the Flies, you could make several connections. Pay close attention not just to the important characters like Jack, Ralph, and Piggy, but how the presence of Jack, a charismatic leader, inspires the kids as a whole to form groups. If they were dropped onto the island at the start of the book with foreknowledge of the book's events, how could they use social psychology to prevent the book's famously tragic end? That's all I have for today. Thanks for listening. Transcript along with sources will be in the description. Good ratings always help get this to the people who need it. See you next time.